So, Roland, the church is called to live in such a way as to create an environment filled with love and free from shame. Into this environment, people are called to walk, to find forgiveness, and find healing. And it's in this place that we discover that an identity built around the shamed self is an identity that is self-focused. It seems like we've already talked about the fact that when we are internalizing shame, we're really more concerned about our perception of self to others than being vulnerable and real with others. And the experience of sanctification is an experience of core identity transformation. We talked about that in an earlier session. And it's an identity transformation from the distorted self to the glory of God's perfect love. Our Wesleyan Holiness message and its focus on the transformed life is adequate and complete in its response to sin and shame. But I'd like for you, if you would, to talk a little more specifically about the role of healing and shame and what that role has in our understanding of sanctification specifically.
Right. I think it's not too big a stretch to recognize that when we've been talking in the past about identity, we're talking about surrender, we even talked about consecration, that we aren't in many ways reflecting on the classical message of the Wesleyan Holiness movement. And that is that God calls us to a life of holiness, that He empowers us to live the life of holiness by His presence in our life, filling us with love. And we capture that encounter experience in the theological phrase entire sanctification. The reality is that shame, best understood, is as an identity experience. Shame tells me who I am. Sanctification, we understand that sanctification is about the process whereby we are set apart for the use and glory of God. That's what we mean by sanctification. To be holy is to be sanctified. And we have throughout our journey as a movement, a Wesleyan Holiness movement, tried to keep in tension this balancing act between entire sanctification and progressive sanctification. We even recognize very clearly that the conversion experience is the initial step of sanctification. It's the initial point at which we are set aside for the glory of God. So the point being that in me, which reflects my self-focus, my desire to satisfy my perception of my needs, is at enmity to God. And that preoccupation in days gone by, we've used various words to describe carnality, the flesh, the sinful nature. But it is a preoccupation with self. Well, if shame is that which distorts our understanding of self, selfishness is actually the life that is lived out by the preoccupation of shame. So shame causes me to separate from others, to withdraw, to isolate, and to focus inwardly upon what I perceive will satisfy my needs. It's the cry of shame, feed me, but we can't ever feed that need enough. So we may, as we develop and mature, learn culturally appropriate ways to respond to that, but we rarely, if ever, find ourselves free of that voice that says you're not good enough, you haven't done enough, do more. And addictions reflect that voice, whether they be addictions with substance abuse or simply addictions to the work environment or educational environment or whatever that addiction might take place. It's a desperate satisfaction to satisfy my need. And so it may be reflected in that angry response to my identity being challenged. At its best, entire sanctification is a representation of death to that preoccupation. It is a surrendering of all of that to Christ himself, that he might become our center, our source of identity, and that our lives will be identified by love. Well, another way of saying identified by love is filled with love. And that was one of John Wesley's love phrases. Perfect love, love made perfect. It's not that we are made perfect. It's that our love finds a singleness of focus around our adoration and devotion to God himself. And so when we start putting all of those pieces together, we can understand how, at the very least, if not comprehensively, at the very least, the experience of tire sanctification is an effective response to the identity of shame. And so, the lived out life, the sanctified life of responding to that which in our life, see, so we could never claim in any moment after an experience of entire sanctification that I am in fact made perfect in my understanding or my capacity to do all that needs to be done. So there's always room for growth. It's never been a part of our theological position that we stop growing once we're entirely sanctified. Well, how would we understand that growth? What is that growth? Well, that growth is in the representation of that preoccupation with God's love in our life. It's the development of what that means. Well, there's a very real sense in which that is the transforming of our minds, and we can clearly see that connection can be made. That the progressive process of sanctification in our life is the transforming of our mind through our lives. And so we can, with very little effort, see a direct line of connection with our long historic position of sanctification and the holy life with deliverance and healing from shame. It may be a new terminology that's capturing what is being understood in the world in which we live more and more clearly, but it's not a new message. It's the same old message that is reflected in the joy and the hope and the peace and the glory of those that have gone before us, that is reflected in the heart core of the church of which we're a part. And to recognize how rich and how complete and how full this message really is a wonderful thing. And is it possible that as we surrender to the healing process of God in our life and the sanctifying presence of the Holy Spirit in our life, we aren't enabling him to more clearly live out love through our lives as we are set free from the power of shame, as we are healed from the power of shame, and what could be more adequate as a declaration of abundant life than that?